Good morning. Hope you all had a beautiful Valentine's Day. We will continue reading from part 1, Drinking from River of Light, The Life of Expression. Keeping the world together. The role of the poet and the artist is to keep the world together. It is said that in ancient times, souls intent on living would reach deep into their wound and bring the fire living there into the light. Then they would wrestle with it and forge into a tool that would help us live. In this way, when we do authentic inner work, we are forging tools for others to use. And just as the body needs healthy cells to stay alive, the universe needs healthy souls to keep going. In this way, when we do authentic inner work, we are sustaining a living force. For when we care for the part, we care for the whole. Here are two stories that speak to the life force that exists between all things and how we are born to keep the world together. The first story is told by a member of the Ojibwe tribe, which settled across the Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada. It seems that the Great Spirit had trouble keeping the world together. When a little worm said he could help, knowing that the secret of life lived in everything, the Great Spirit welcomed the little worm's help. So the Great Spirit said, "Help us, little worm." And the little worm slowly spun its barely seeable silk threads, connecting all of the creation with a delicate web. The Great Spirit smiled, and its smile cast a light across the earth, making the web of connection briefly visible. The Great Spirit marveled at the little worm's industrious gift, for the worm was not clever or brilliant, but simply devoted to being and doing what it was put here to do, to inch through the earth, spinning from its guts a fine thread that holds everything together. And so the Great Spirit said to the little worm, "You have saved us, little worm, not by being great or bold, but by staying true to your own nature. I will let you live forever." The little worm was stunned and somewhat frightened. The Great Spirit saw this and said, "Don't you want to live forever?" The little worm inched closer. "Oh, Father, I fear so many years if I can't grow." The Great Spirit smiled again at the wisdom of one of its smallest creatures. "Very well, little worm. I will only let you grow into forever. I will give you the ability to spin this precious thread that connects everything around yourself. And when you can enclose yourself within that web and quiet your urge to inch and squirm away, then you will know the likeness of being that I know." The little worm bowed and began to search for a leaf on which to grow. And this is how the Great Spirit enabled the worm to spin the very first cocoon, from its quietude become the very, very first butterfly. The story affirms that everything in creation is connected, and that what holds everything together comes from humble work of living on earth, spinning from our guts a fine thread that holds everything together. It tells us that the experience of eternity is possible if we immerse ourselves firsthand in the barely seeable web of connections. Humbly a little worm, it is in us to work our experience, our pain, our frustration, and confusion and wonder into threads of silk. Freely, it is our choice to first connect everything with our experience, then to make a cocoon of those connections, and thirdly, to enter the cocoon of experience. The way a Native American sweats in his lodge, the way a yogi holds her third eye, the way a monk maintains his vow of silence. The story tells us that if we still ourselves long enough within the web of all there is, we will eventually come to know the likeness of God's being. Our job, then, is to spin, name, and repair the barely seeable threads that connect everything. The second story, from a prose poem written in 1894, by Oscar Wilde called The Artist. In the poem, a sculptor is moved to create the piece that abides in every moment in bronze. But there is no more bronze left in the world, except in the image of the sorrow that endures forever, which he himself created and set on the tomb of someone he loved. The sculptor is moved to visit the tomb of his lost friend. After reliving their time together, he finally takes the image of sorrow and melts it down in his furnace. And out of the sorrow that endures forever, the sculptor creates the peace that abides in every moment. Wilde shows us that there is no way, no other way. Minimizing our sorrow or denying the pain of a journey or obsessing about the gross indecency of injustice, none of these efforts will bring us peace. Only by putting our sorrow and the pain of our journey into the heart's fire can we melt the sorrow that endures forever to its essential element. Only by meeting life and not running from it can we mold and recast what we've been through into the peace that abides in every moment. This is a profound work which no one knows quite how to do, but do it we must. Our inner destiny is to connect everything in life and to transform sorrow into peace. How, then, do you spin, name, and repair the barely seeable threads that connect everything? And how do you transform the sorrows that endures forever into the peace that abides in every moment? Just as the body needs healthy cells to stay alive, the universe needs healthy soul to keep going. The art of perception. An artist must be able to remain aware of everything around him. But once he finds what he needs, he must focus like a laser on it. Like a whale swimming through the ocean, taking in vast amounts of seawater, then straining out what he needs. Romer Bearden. What it means to perceive. Poetry is a portal, a means of perception. All art is. And just as we can see the every very energy of existence through a microscope, we can see the vibrancy at center of all life through a heart of our mind. When we are clear of bias and noise, under all the shaping of words, poetry is the threshold of perception, through which we taste the shimmer of spirit that informs us everything. The word perceive and the word receive have the same Latin root, percipere, which means to understand from per, which means entirely, and capire, which means to take. To perceive, then, means to take things in entirely, completely, in a way that covers us with understanding. But first, we must put down our screens and filters. Once life enters us, then it is useful to discern what has entered. But often we block the true gift of perception by sorting things before they reach us and touch us. The gift of perception resides in sustaining our sensitivity to wonder, which means that, while we can always learn from others, we are called to be touched by life directly. We are called to maintain our first-hand experience, which then can be integrated with the experience of others. For true perception takes place below all the values and maps we inherit. The great Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore taught his students not to conform to others, but to think freely for themselves. And the profound painter Vincent van Gogh affirmed this when he said, "I dream my painting, and then I paint my dream." My second book, an epic poem called Fire Without Witness, came to me in such a dream of perception, which then took 10 years to bring to life. The book centers on Michelangelo's painting of Sistine Chapel ceiling and how the characters paints come alive to tell their stories as well. And I confess, I didn't have a clue where this was going. I was just following the path of perception as far as I could, trusting that another part of the path would present itself, which it did. The epic poem showed itself in Arian Dane's thread. In 1978, I had finished a manuscript and was going to take a break. As I went to sleep that night, I had a vision. I have no idea why. Perhaps it was intuition. But it was a vision of Michelangelo, pondering the empty ceiling. I thought maybe it was an image I'd used somewhere, so I jotted down. The next day, as I was on my way to a workshop, I realized I had no idea what the ceiling looked like. I'd stared at it in books, but hadn't truly seen it. I quickly went to the nearest library and pulled out several texts. I spent 3 hours taking notes, and by the end of the next day, the structure of the entire epic poem was clear in my head. 6 months later, I had written 100 pages. Then I realized I didn't know enough to continue, but I had written enough that the challenge of the project became clear. A symphony of voices was emerging, and I began working more as a conductor than a poet. I could let the voices haphazardly interact or have them echo and counterpoint across the book. That meant I had to plan the journey of the book. That caused me to do real research. It took 6 years before I went back to writing the poem. During that time, I assembled over 400 pages of notes and charts, schematics, enough to teach art history. It became clear, as I read all the biographies and different takes on Michelangelo and his time, that history is an eye witness telling an ear witness telling a pen witness. As you get farther from the eyewitness, there are just clusters of opinion, where there are many imaginations of others to overlap. And the most exciting challenges where there isn't any corroboration of incidents. Then the facts become voice in a channel. But how you story tell your way from boy to boy becomes the terrain of historical fiction. After all that research, the book had a gravity on its own. And though I was obsessed with it, I could only work on it for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. It would beat me up, and I would have to take a break. But it was never an option to stop altogether. I was so far into deep, mysterious tunnel that the only way out was to find the end of it. When we let life in, it will guide us and form us. For the rush of perception comes as a gift that will call who we are into being, and we can accept life as our teacher. After finishing my epic poem and exhausting my out of balance creative drive, I was struck down by cancer. In this unexpected tumble, the depth of my perception expanded vastly because of my near death experience in my 30s. I was rushed by life so fully and harshly, I had no choice but to take in life entirely at felt level. There, I was ripped free of all the maps I had inherited and covered so thoroughly with understanding that I feared I would drown. But there was a particular moment of perception that transformed me completely. I had a bone marrow sampling and a spinal tap during the same hospital visit. Afterward, I was sent home bit battered and told a lie still for 6 to 8 hours, because moving before the spinal fluid had a chance to regenerate would cause a migraine. Well, it was hard for me to be still, and every time I moved, I was thrust back down on the couch in pain. It was as if the force of life was insisting that I be still. I finally looked out the window to see an apple tree in my front yard. I had seen this tree 100 times, yet never really looked at it. Now, Unable to move without inducing pain, I was forced into a moment of indigenous perception. Seeing the apple tree freshly, it came alive, and I listened to the tree for the very first time. Strange it was. The apple tree spoke to me, not in words, but with a bare presence that said, "When you survive this, there will be no more making things up. When you survive, you will only bear witness to the truth of things as they are. There is no explaining such a moment of apprehension. You can dismiss it if you want, as some have, as an hallucination due to the medicine or the pain. But I know the truth of that mysterious moment, and it has shaped my life to this day." I called my experience with the apple tree a moment of indigenous perception. What do I mean by this? Let me unfold it in this way. Taking in the sea completely with our mind allows us to grasp its enormity, while taking in the sea completely with our heart allows us to hear the ancient sea speak. This is the crucial difference between modern perception and indigenous perception. Modern perception expands our horizon and timeline, while indigenous perception allows us to relate to everything more deeply, as a center of living unto itself. This is what the great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber expanded on his naming of the I-thou relationship. When we receive life this thoroughly, everything we encounter appears as a living center unto itself. Then God or divinity appears in the unrehearsed conversations between living centers. This is another way to understand the gifts of perception. It brings to life the conversation between living things. When forced to be still, when forced to stop thinking and planning and worrying, I apprehend the apple tree as a living center unto itself. Doing so, I was able to experience the tree rather than the outline and grasp it with my mind. And as Buber would say, God spoke through the tree in an unrehearsed moment of conversation with life. When I open to life this thoroughly, perception is the courage to cross the invisible wall between us and the life 10 times a day, with no exception of what we might accomplish. It takes courage because the wall always seems taller and thicker before we take that first step. But step we must, even if our effort of perception is only for a minute. We must step into the garden of our heart, into the walk with our dog, into the woods for a run, or sit down to journal, or take a shower to let the water of eternity rush through the shower head, briefly erasing our fears. Let one small perception lead to the next, knowing that letting things in completely is traveling as far as going around the world. When we let life in, it will guide us from and form us. For the rush of perception comes as a gift that will call who we are into being. We can accept life as a teacher. To see one thing in another. In Boston, in the early 80s, an old friend lent me a scratchy record. There, I heard this ancient wisdom echoed by a contemporary singer, Lourdes Pita. Everything in the universe is interconnected. Within each, it is all reflected. Ever since, I have found testaments to this spiritual fact in nature and biology and art from every age. In the 13th century, the great Zen teacher Dogen suggested that any momentary sense of enlightenment is deeply tied to realizing that each part carries the whole. Consider his magnificent image of a dewdrop. Enlightenment is like the moon reflected in a dewdrop on a blade of grass. The moon does not get wet, nor the drop of water broken, and the whole moon and the entire sky are reflected even one drop of water. When I was young, I was overwhelmed with so much of life racing through me. I didn't know myself and often felt like a drop of water breaking, always spilling the moon and the sky. Finally, I stopped analyzing and unraveling what I knew to be true and trusted my own direct experience of life. When all alone, with the sun on my face, I felt the miracle of existence in a way that couldn't be broken down or undetermined. Building on those irreducible moments, I came to know myself. Over the past 50 years, I have come to understand that this experience of irreducible moments is what informs the inner life of not just a poet, but an artist. And not just an artist, but an authentic soul blessed to be completely itself. When able to feel the taproot of existence, we are very close to the common nature that informs all things. It seems that inner always mirrors outer, and the part always reveals the whole. Each of us, when most ourselves are momentarily conduits, lightning rods of the whole, transmitting the essence of things to one another, and so art is the expression of experience that reveals the inherent connection between all things. In my late 20s, I was rowing on a small lake in the Adirondacks. When the breeze settled, I stopped rowing and drifted to the other side. There were no cabins, just banks of broken birch, a few jutting rocks, and small boat was gently scraping through a patchy of pads. The sun broke through, and it made me lift one pad without breaking its tether to the bottom. As I turned the wet pad over, I was astonished to discover that the underside resembled a living heart. Its pattern of wet veins seemed an anatomical map of breathing aorta, and its thin stem disappearing to the bottom seemed its unblickable vein. This was an affirmation that when we stop to truly look, we always begin to see one thing in another, all things reflected in each. This is the artist's job, to look deep enough and wide enough to find the universe and its infinite connections reflected in the smallest lily pad barely turned over. It wasn't long after that moment on the lake that I learned of Monet and Van Gogh and how they saw the painted inner patterns of energy and light. It was the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, a friend of Monet, who characterized him as a human microscope at a time when the actual microscope was being invented. It is compelling that both Monet and Van Gogh were looking so deeply into nature that they stumbled into very fabric. They seemed to look under the skin of existence, painting the muscle and blood and vein of nature that keeps the existence going. Now, I look for these unexpected mirrors in everything. Now, I believe that all art and all of what art expresses is already fully formed somewhere in the very fabric of things, just waiting for us to discover it and express it. The way Dogen's dewdrops reveals its reflection on the entire moon. In truth, anything looked at closely enough will reveal the suchness of life that flows through everything. In this way, all creativity is a discovery of what is already present, but otherwise unseeable. The effort to create and express is a communication of inner and outer, of finding the large in the small and the small in the large. Art, in its most authentic expression, is always rejoining the to the mystery of the whole. And once revealed, those patterns are our teachers. Art is the expression of experience that reveals the inherent connection between all things. The web of metaphor. Like an interior form of nature, metaphor exists regardless of whether we see it or not. It is there to be seen, the way a vista is seen for the climb. But for both the metaphor and the view are there even when we neglect the climb. After a lifetime of climbing, it's clear that human form of light is love, and only presence and time can warm love into the open. The way immense sunshine and heat can draw the light within a seed planted in the earth to seek its own nature and somehow break ground. This comparison is a metaphor. I was born with the ability to see in metaphor. This is how I relate to the living oneness of things. From the earliest age, the world has spoken to me in this way. The analogous relationship of things has called, not in words, but in silent language that has somehow shown me, however briefly, the web of connection under everything. This gift is a function of presence. When I am present enough, metaphors appear. There are teachers, they are my teachers. All of my poems are just notes from these teachers. Seeing how things go together sustains me. The fact that I've lived a life as a poet is a testament to my friendship with metaphor. Along the way, the life of poetry exposed itself as a life of spirit. This, in turn, is a testament to my friendship with the connectedness of all things. For metaphor exists to reveal and praise the oneness of things. Ultimately, it doesn't matter if we write anything down or not. True poetry happens the instant a metaphor is seen. The rest is blessed labor to make the invisible visible. My own path of listening has led me over time into conversation with everything, with mystery, with God, or with Source, with the rivers of change, with you. As I get older, I long even more for the wisdom and companionship of other living things, to stay in conversation with all I love, with all I admire, with all who have suffered and given of themselves to stay alive and to keep life going. My passion now is to stay as close as possible to the pulse of what is kind and true, to stay in conversation with whatever happens, and to experience more and more ways to listen. Over the years, the trail of these conversations have become the books I write. The further I go, the more of one water they are, as if each book is different shaped bucket, which I haul to the sea, scooping what I can. This comparison is also a metaphor. Each book I retrieve uncovers some learning that leads to the next inquiry. In this way, each book is a teacher, leading me more deeply into the many ways of being here. The great Jungian teacher, Joseph Campbell, offered that metaphor is the primary way to bring into the view of whole of life. As such, metaphors reveal the connections between things. The assumption inherent in all metaphor is that everything is connected. And the poet's job and the awakened soul's work is to reveal, inhabit it, and sustain those connections. In time, the web of metaphor offers us a glimpse into the luminous gears of the universe that keeps everything together. For every pattern revealed by a metaphor shows another aspect of how the universe works. One of the things I love most about writing is that I don't conceive or think up images or metaphors. I discover them. Metaphors come forward in an unplanted unfolding like broken field running in football, or a fast break in basketball, or like a wave of improvised jazz. I lean into some field of feeling or pursue some question, idea, or story, and all of a sudden, the effort becomes an unrehearsed discovery of connections, and images and metaphors appear. We discover metaphors by surrendering our attention and staying in honest conversation with the quiet movements of life as they appear before us. Let me share a recent example. I was visiting Pine Manor, a retreat center for psychological and spiritual exploration in Lake Elsinore, California, where I teach every year. My good friend Gail Warner founded and directs Pine Manor. She is wise, old soul, I like to come a day early so that Gail and I can re enter our lifelong conversations about the mystery of being here. This time, while driving through the mountains, Gail began to tell me of Hades, the Greek lord of death, who surprises us by pulling a loved one from our midst, dragging them into the underworld. She shared that when her father died, when she was young, her mother was dragged there as well. Though she was still walking around and caring for her, Gail wondered now about the presence of Hades in her life and asked, how was I abducted by grief along the way? This is a profound question because everyone is affected by death. As we were driving, I began to imagine Hades in the valley beside the road waiting underground for the next person he could snatch. I imagined him pulling someone from us into the underworld, the way he might fist a set of roots and pull the tangle of roots deeper into the earth. And that's when the metaphor appeared. For every time Hades takes someone from us, he pulls the network of relationships connected to that person as well, and the roots of the living are tugged underground. This metaphor helps us understand the impact of grief on the living. We are all connected, and so we can't help but be pulled toward all the lives under the surface when someone dies. This is why we follow those who die, leaning toward their disappearance. When Hades takes someone we love, we undergo too. When someone we love is pulled under by grief, we are not separate from them, but part of the tangle of the relationships that binds us. And so, we are all pulled in varying degrees when someone dies. Everyone is affected. Now, the question becomes, how has the pull of your tangle affected you and everyone around you? The sun came out to sweep the mountains as we drove on, and Hades seemed to turn away from the light for now. But by sharing what matters along the way, Gail and I had stumbled onto this metaphor that reveals a truth about a passage that no one can escape. This is just one example. No matter the subject or the pattern, metaphor is to the words that what lights is to objects. As objects make light visible, words make metaphors knowable. In the deepest regard, each of us is a living metaphor, here to expose, reveal, and live in, and inhabit the web of connections that makes up the world. Metaphors make visible the incandescent filaments of being that draw us into the world. Metaphors reveal the connection between things. The assumption inherent in all the metaphor is that everything is connected, and the poet's job and the awakened soul's work is to reveal, inhabit, and sustain those connections. The aperture of intuition. The opposite of rational is not irrational but intuitive. And while the mind and heart work together, my experience is that the heart absorbs and integrates more deeply than the mind. One way to think of intuition is as an aperture that opens and closes the heart like the lens of a camera, letting in the life until its colors our souls. Reason is often intermediary for a quicker, deeper, more elusive facility. Reason allows us to think like a ladder, while intuition allows us to think like a constellation. Weaving both, I write about what I need to know, not what I already know. If I had only written about what I know all these years, I would have written very little. The truth is that I feel things more quickly and more deeply than I understand them. I understand things more quickly and deeply than I can speak about them. When I speak things more quickly and deeply than I can write them. One of the reasons I am so prolific in that years ago, I gave up the notion that I had to understand what I was feeling, thinking, speaking, or writing before I could put it down. Since that time, my writing has become an ongoing curriculum because I no longer record. what I understand, but explore what I feel. I write because I have questions, and often the writing leads to more questions, not answers. But in the process of expressing, something happens that's valuable to the act of living. And in the same way that a flame gives off heat, I believe that if my expressive search is clear enough and authentic enough, chances are the heat of that fire will warm others. I have been asked if intuition is divinely inspired. I wholeheartedly say yes, but I want to enlarge divine to include the Taoist notion that the world is informed by an elusive and incomprehensible yet all powerful current or life force, whether we call that current God or something else. Lao Tzu says, find the current and things will become clear. The way running water cleanses a rock. The act of living produces oxidation, tarnish, and moss, all of which cover the rock. But like water running over us, the act of feeling, perceiving, and expressing cleanses us off. When the rock, that is me, is clean, I'm most open to the current around me. Intuition appears when we get out of the way. The mind tries to measure, weigh, and discern things that are beyond its capacity to measure, weigh, and discern. So there are times when we have to suspend the mind's want to measure what it meets. In order to eat, we have to chew our food to make it small enough to digest. But once that's done, it is no way resembles what we took in. The challenge, spiritually, emotionally, and mentally, is not to make everything we take in assume our shape in order to enter us, but to find ways to open up so we can take it and things as they are and therefore be affected by them. I write because I have questions, and often the writing leads to more questions, not answers. But in the process of expressing, something happens that's valuable to the act of living. Releasing the divine. There are two beautiful notions that speak to our innate yearning to release and be released by the divine. What I mean by the divine is the inherent quality of spirit that informs everything in life. One notion that speaks to the uncovering of the divine is Michelangelo's sense that the statue is already in the stone, and that rather than create the statue, our task is to figure out a way to realize it. The legendary sculptor would carve away the excess marble to reveal the statue already waiting in the block of uncut stone, as if he were freeing a prisoner from a deep sleep. Giorgio Vasari, the biographer of so many Renaissance artists, compared Michelangelo's sculpting process to someone pulling a beautiful form from underwater. The form is complete, but out of view until lifted into the world. What's powerful here is that this is what life does to us. Experience carves away all that is not essential from us until, like Michelangelo's statues, we are realized from our sleep and lifted into the world. Another notion that speaks to the transference of the divine is Carl Jung's sense of the poet as a conduit for the collective unconsciousness, which I mentioned earlier. Jung sees the poet and the artist as a lightning rod for the aggregate of dreams, memories, and experiences of humanity, which come to life through the thoroughly personal story of the creative individual. These two notions imply that everything already exists. For instance, you could look at the same patch of sea 100 times, but one day when the light is right and you're tired enough, you look at the rise and swell of the waves and it says something to you. Something that's parallel what's growing or not growing inside you. Now, did the sea suddenly emanate more meaning? No. The world is steadily infusing us with the divine, depending on the level of our openness. As human beings, We are a beautiful braid of the infinite and the finite. While our being is bottomless, our humanness has limits. That's the cursed blessing that has us looking everywhere for what's right before us and within us. In time, we discover that everything carries the divine. It's all here, waiting quietly in the open to be manifest by nothing less than the complete surrender of our attention and care. As a young poet, I have I was always on the look for the things to write about, concerned with how to manipulate and squeeze content or context out of any circumstances. But gradually, I came to a place where, if I opened myself authentically, something arose from my center, which I term voice. I began to realize that it's not about searching for things to write about, but realizing the divine that waits in everything. It doesn't matter what we are writing about. If we bring our full being to whatever is before us, the divine carried in the things of the world will reveal itself through us. Realizing the numinous quality of spirit that informs everything through our creativity and expression is the way of the all art, which leads us to the purpose of all art, which is to enliven our inherent kingship with all things. Experience carves away all that is not essential from us until, like Michelangelo's statue, we are realized from our sleep and lifted into the world. The craft of perception. The aim of art is not to represent the outward appearance of things, but their inward significance. Aristotle. Jennifer Blessing, a curator at a museum in New York City, has said that artists pursue various methods of liberating the mind in order to access the marvelous. We are all looking for ways to widen our lens of perception so that we can be more alive. The Black Mountain poet Robert Creeley declared in the 1950s that forms follows content. And so we keep searching for forms of expression that will open and liberate the confines of our mind, so we can access and inhabit the marvelous. What we do to find the form that keeps us close to life constitutes the craft of perception. For me, the craft of perception has led to an all-inclusive form that uses the genres as various tools in one big toolbox. While each genre is worthy of a lifetime's devotion, I have been led to use each as needed in whatever I'm writing, no matter what I'm exploring or expressing. So, all my work is poetry, whether in stanzas or paragraphs, because all my work seeks to express the truth of life through the filter of my heart, and all my work is personable memoir, because the lens of the eye is the only window we have on life, and all my work is anthropology, because the world is always more than just me. If I need to do research while describing the patterns of life, then I pursue scholarship. If I need to unfold the story of another's life along the way, then I include biography. If I need to illustrate an insight in the form of a story, then I rely on a fiction. And if I'm led to weave ideas, then I venture into philosophy. But it all merges into one vibrant, seamless form, which I have no name for. Each of us must find the one form that will welcome the questions that will liberate our mind. That form and the path to that form may look different for everyone, but there is one practice that can help us find our form. That is the practice of honoring. For the word honor means to keep what is true in view. To keep what is true in view is an ethic to live by. When I honor you as my friend, I keep what I know to be true about you in view, especially when you can't honor yourself. When I honor myself, I keep what I know to be true about my soul in view, especially when I'm troubled or feeling lost. When I honor the lineage of my ancestors, I keep what I know to be true about all those lives which have made my life possible. Keeping what is true in view is a steadfast way to expand our perception and liberate our minds. So, what question is opening you? What forms are you searching for that will liberate your mind? And how can you better honor your soul by keeping what you know to be true in view? Answering these questions is the beginning of your personal craft of perception. Another important ethic to live by and write by is the marriage of truth and kindness. In graduate school, I found myself in the era of the workshop, in which a tough skin was required if you were to be taken seriously. Workshops were brutal, and often bloody conversations in which teachers and peers would impose preference as truth and dispense their judgments harshly. What I come to believe firmly and wholeheartedly is that the truth and kindness are not mutually exclusive. There is no reason that truth can be offered accurately with love. Feedback does not have to be served with knife. Furthermore, truthful feedback about writing does not consist of bending an apprentice to the style or form of their teacher. The teacher's job is to help the apprentice develop their own form of expression, be thoroughly themselves, and practice keeping what they know to be true in the view. This is how a teacher honors their student. Toward the end, I offer a few covenants around which to meet, whether in a classroom or in a living room. Ensure confidentiality. Invite everyone to listen to each other's work with the aim of helping each person say what it is they have to say in the clearest way possible. This is different than steering people to write the way you do. Be specific in writing and feedback. It does one little good to say, "This is great," or "This is terrible." Rather, "This works for me because," or "This doesn't work for me because." Encourage each other to view writings as discovery and retrieval, like fishing up something from the deep rather than invention of or creating something out of nothing. Encourage each other to view writing as a way to be in a relationship with deep and life-giving material, as opposed to authoring and mastering material. Invite everyone to read their work aloud and to share how they have been deepened, broadened, or changed for retrieving it and expressing it. Enter writing experiences together, not just feedback sessions. For example, invite everyone to write to music at some time, or have everyone go to an art exhibit together in silence and write in response to it, or invite everyone to bring and read a poem, and that has been significant to them, and to share why. The writer Raj Gill said, "When I say to myself, I know, I rob myself of the now, and shutting down the now closes our windows to life." The first commitment to our craft of perception is to keep our window of life open. The second commitment is to honor our own journey by keeping what we know to be true in view. And the third commitment is to offer truth with kindness so that we can meet life and grow. But the fourth commitment is harder to put into words. It involves keeping a heart open while tumbling through experience. The poet and the Jungian analyst Clarissa Pinkola Stace offers this guidance. How to write a poem. Climb to the top of the tallest tree. Step onto the branch you fear will break beneath your weight. Let it break. Write your poem before you reach the ground. The craft of perception isn't entered just to see, but to help us better express what we see, so we can learn from that expression and live more fully. Each of us must find the one form that will welcome the questions, that will liberate our mind. Thank you for listening.